Well, I think after that introduction, it's all downhill from here. I will say that the key, of course, to a high H index is one, of course, to live long enough, but most important is to work with the smartest people on the planet, and the guy that just introduced me is at the very top of that list. Okay, so why don't we get started? I think there it is, our first declaration. We can move right on. So it's a great pleasure to be here this morning to present the Lauterbur lecture. Here's a picture of Paul, of course, seen with his colleague Peter Mansfield. It's a great picture, but I was always wondering, why are these guys smiling? Well, maybe we'll answer that question. Okay. Of course, when you get offered to give these honorary talks, you get asked many months in advance. And when I was asked to give this presentation, I tried to think of something to talk about that was a little different than the usual dog and pony show, cool, high-resolution pictures, the brain doing stupid brain tricks, etc. So I came up with this somewhat audacious title. After 20 years, has fMRI actually changed the world? Of course, once they put it officially in the program, I immediately regretted this title. But nevertheless, I was stuck with it. It's in the program, so I'm going to do my best to talk a little bit about it. I'll basically break the talk into two sections. First, kind of a brief, somewhat personal perspective on what happened 20 years ago. And then we'll talk about what the implications of that work have been in a number of different domains. Well, so what happened 20 years ago? 20 years ago was actually an anniversary of another kind, in this case for our society or its parent organization, the ISMRM. It was, in fact, in 1991 that the ISMRM had its 10th anniversary celebration. And while there was a tremendous amount of very cool MRI and MRS presented at that meeting, there were two particular presentations that I think are especially relevant in the context of today's talk. The first was from this fellow, Jack Beliveau, in a poster he presented as part of the Young Investigator Award competition that year. In this work, he used dynamic susceptibility contrast, MR, to map cerebral blood volume changes seen as a function of functional activation. The subtraction images that you see on the bottom right there, I believe are actually the first unequivocal images of human brain function seen with magnetic resonance. And of course led to this somewhat iconic image and a subsequent paper of this work that he published. Now, of course, DSC has long since been supplanted as a principal means by which we image human brain function, but it's actually worth looking at this discussion that he had in the abstract, because in fact Jack was actually quite prophetic in imagining what the potential of the field would be. And I'll just highlight the two key concepts he made. First, that MR could be used, in this case his proposal was through the use of stable intravascular tracers to be able to look at dynamic changes in brain function using those stable intravascular tracers. And the second key concept, if I can get my mouse, is just that when we did this kind of dynamic imaging, then we were no longer limited in the spatial resolution of the technique to the time between injections the way we were with PET measurements and, in fact, his own experiments. But, in fact, the temporal resolution of fMRI would be limited by the hemodynamic response time of the brain, which is measured not in minutes or even tens of seconds, but sub-second time frames. Well, there were two important developments that occurred in previous years at this very society that were to take that basic concept and really give it the inspiration it needed to move the field of functional imaging forward. And these were, of course, the two principal means for endogenous contrast, endogenous vascular contrast, hemodynamic contrast. One of these, of course, was the developments in perfusion imaging by Don Gentry and Alan Koretsky in their development of arterial spin labeling. This remains the principal means by which we take quantitative physiologic maps of changing cerebrovascular physiology, and is increasingly used today in studies where the time constants of the changes we're looking for are long, measured instead of seconds, measured in minutes to hours to days. This is the tool that we use. The other, of course, was the elegantly described and a beautiful presentation by Dr. Ogawa for the Mansfield lecture just a few days ago in his description of the discovery and elaboration of bold contrast. This key finding, developed in concert with his collaborators, Camille Lergabil and others at the University of Minnesota, provided the key insights that are used to this day as the dominant mechanism by which we get functional contrast in almost all of the human functional brain imaging experiments that we do today. Well, these concepts, dynamic imaging, endogenous contrast, came together and were first presented in another plenary talk, one given at this very meeting 20 years ago by this gentleman, my mentor and colleague, Tom Brady. During his presentation on the future prospects for MRI, he presented the work of this colleague, Ken Kwong. Look at this picture closely. This may be the only time you see Ken in a necktie. In any case, Ken, working with a number of colleagues, Jack and others within the lab, and other colleagues, and notably Bob Turner, who's in this audience, who is an external collaboration of Ken's, ended up taking this remarkable movie, which I can see is just going. Simple subtraction images, but dynamic images of cerebrovascular physiology, in this case, using those same goggles that Jack had used, but turning them on and off in a dynamic setting. The first dynamic functional images. They were shown at this meeting. Oh, there we go. Next slide. So I asked Ken if he would share with me his lab notebook. And he showed me this remarkable pair of pages. So let me help you interpret this quite, because it's actually extremely interesting when you look at it closely. The first thing to notice is the date. May 9th, it says, 1991. This was almost 20 years ago to the week from today at this meeting. And it was at that time that Ken acquired his very first functional brain images, which you see. But there's other things on here that are worth looking at. The first sketched out was the original description of block design paradigms for fMRI. Now, of course, today that's routine, but keep in mind that 20 years ago, all functional imaging experiments were performed by single time point injections followed by minutes of delay and simple comparisons of those. This was the first time that he used the full dynamic contrast that Jack had envisioned in his poster to look at functional brain mapping. He also, on this slide, described bold contrast through the use of gradient echo images, which he acquired that day. And because at the time it was unknown whether bold contrast or flow contrast would give ultimately better SNR, he also did experiments using arterial spin label or CBF contrast. So in the course of a single day's experiment, he developed a conceptual paradigm for block design fMRI and performed experiments on the two dominant modes of endogenous contrast that we use today, gradient echo bold imaging and arterial spin label flow imaging. For you graduate students out there, this is what I would consider a decent day's work. So get to work. Okay, so that's the history. Let's try to think of what the implications of this have been. Well, has it changed the world? That's a little bit of a broad topic, so let's try to break it up, look at it in a couple different metrics. We can obviously talk about kind of the scientific impact, use these kind of quantitative metrics that Greg was talking about. We can talk about its impact on clinical practice, and maybe think about some broader societal impacts it may have had. So let's start with the easy one first, scientific impact. You know, how does fMRI compare, for example, just using simple quantitative metrics, to other kind of important high-profile scientific discoveries? Excuse me just one second. You'd think with all the talks I've given, I wouldn't be nervous standing up here, but you get nervous in front of a big group. Okay, so just do a simple citation search on PubMed for fMRI and related terms, and you get a graph like this one, still remarkably going up. At this point, more than 3,000 new articles a year, and a total number of citations over the 20 years since its original description of something like 21,000 articles. So how does this compare to other notable discoveries? Well, in some, it's actually looking pretty good. For example, if you look at telomerase or telomere DNA, you get human papillomavirus or HPV, you see that those very important discoveries have something like half the number of citations. On the other hand, if you look at things like RNAi or in vitro fertilization, again, very important discoveries and inventions, they're roughly comparable to fMRI, something in the order of 20 to 25,000. But of course, if you keep looking, you're going to find some that have much more, things like knockout mice, more than 80,000, or HIV, the discoveries there, more than 66,000. And of course, the big dog in the world of citations is one that this organization is largely responsible for. Almost 300,000 citations for magnetic resonance imaging. I think now I know why Paul and Peter were smiling in that picture. This is not bad. Well, okay, so in the end, what's the score? Well, fMRI, more than some, about the same as others, less than some really big discoveries. So I guess I'm going to have to give it kind of a plus minus. Not bad, but we got a little bit more work to do. Well, how about in some other domains? How about medical practice? Clearly, fMRI is now a tool that we use in some centers routinely in a number of different settings. Of course, we're very used to popular press reports of the kind of work that we do, the impact of functional imaging studies on our understanding of a variety of neurological diseases. I just happened to grab an article that came out just a short while ago. This is a description of neurologists' work which paint the very grim picture in the brain, changes in the brain of players of the video game Madden football and its effect on the brain. Here you can see that they basically talk about the functional studies which look at the damaged neural pathways associated with motivation and attention, malformations that help explain the inability among players to perform such basic functions as maintaining hygiene or the ability to feed themselves. So if you want to read more about this, you can go to my favorite and most reliable news source, The Onion. Okay, well, somewhat more seriously. In fact, there have been a number of large and very nice review articles published on the impact over the last 20 years of functional imaging studies. This one published in the American Journal of Neuroradiology. This other one by Wegenroth published in European Radiology, both of which are quite bullish on the overall prospects of clinical functional magnetic resonance imaging for pre-surgical planning. Just a quote here, that pre-surgical MRI can substantially contribute to the reduction of therapy-associated morbidity and consequent hospitalization time. So quite a positive statement. But in another recent review, just a few years before that, by Stefan Sennart, who also looked at fMRI for pre-surgical planning, he noted, like the others, that the tools seemed to work reliably in a number of different settings, but reminded us of this very important fact that, at least as of the time of this review, and I think this is still true today, that there really haven't been careful, randomized clinical control trials which show the benefits and final outcome of this tool. And as a result, its status as a fully clinically accepted tool is really still a work in progress. So, as a result, its impact on medical practice, well, it's having an impact, but it's still a relatively modest one, relatively small patient populations. And I'd have to say that its overall impact, has it really changed the world of medical practice? Probably not quite yet. But we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this point in a bit. Of course, when we think about functional imaging, we don't just think about pre-surgical planning and its clinical applications. We think about its ability to give us information and insights into the broader realms of human brain function. So perhaps we can talk about its impact in the domain of cognitive neuroscience. Now, somewhat surprisingly, 20 years on, there is still some significant skepticism out there in the cognitive neuroscience community about the meaning and the role of functional imaging in teaching us new things. There's actually a very thoughtful critique of the field by Max Coldhart. Perhaps functional neuroimaging has not told us anything about the mind, at least so far. But if you read this issue of Cortex, it was actually an entire issue devoted both to his critique and then the response to this critique from some of the world's best neuroscientists. You'll see that he's certainly in the minority opinion, and the wide range, the widest number of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists around the world believe that functional imaging has taught us fundamentally new things about how the brain works in a number of different domains. Of course, if you ask a cognitive scientist, what's the most important impact of functional MR in your work, they'll talk about the work that they know the best. For example, Hans Breiter shared with me the impact of functional imaging on our understanding of affect and emotion, and referred back to the early work of Scott Rausch, a psychiatrist at McLean's Hospital. Reward circuitry and its impact on the neuroeconomics was another theme that came up in my discussions. Memory. Moshe Bar mentioned that there's been a sea change in our conceptualization of memory from a retrospective, backwards-looking function to one that's actually the key for future prediction, that memory is really about giving us the information we need to make future predictions. And this very process, this integration of memory circuits with thinking about the future, come together in the discovery that Randy Buckner put at the top of his list when I talked to him, and that's the development of default mode. And of course, this goes on and on. I'll just give one example where I'll show just one area, another domain that came up as a common theme among many of the cognitive scientists that I spoke to, and that's that we've developed a fundamentally new perspective on the plasticity of the human brain and the related notions of human brain development over the last 20 years. Marina Bedney shared this slide of her own work and some other very important complementary slides, just as an example. This is investigations using functional imaging of language processing in patients who are congenitally blind. And the key finding here, of course, is that the dominant activation they saw in these tasks was not in typical language areas, but was in the back of the brain and the primary visual cortex. Quite a remarkable discovery and not a subtle finding whatsoever. Nevertheless, you might see this finding and say, well, does that really mean that that part of the brain was actually doing language? Well, the answer is, it looks like it is. There was a number of studies, a pair of studies by Amir Ahmadi and his many colleagues, one of which he actually showed that the activation in this primary visual cortex was highly correlated with verbal memory performance, so it was actually involved and related to how well people actually did tasks. And then they took it the next step. They used transcutaneous magnetic stimulation to actually interfere with activity in the visual cortex and showed that that had a negative impact on verbal processing in these blind patients. So in other words, yes, the brain has remapped to the point where this part of the brain was actually being used for language. The whole notion that we are kind of inbred with these functional units, visual cortex, motor cortex, really needs to be rethought on the basis of studies like this. And just in case you were saying, well, that's fine, these are congenitally blind people, of course the brain is going to be different growing up. In fact, Alvaro Pasqualeone and his colleagues did another experiment where they just blindfolded normally sighted people and showed that over the course of just a few days, there was actually, it's a little hard to see for me, my guess is it might be for you, but there it is, primary visual cortex activation, which appears in this case for another sensory input, somatosensory input or touch, which then reverses over time. The brain is much more plastic than we understood it to be 20 years ago, and functional imaging studies were a huge part of our understanding of that. The related concept of brain development is also one that functional imaging has made a huge contribution to our understanding of normal human development and, of course, abnormal development. And I'll just show one slide from one of my favorite developmental neuropsychologists, B.J. Casey, and her study of frontostriatal circuitry. The thing that made me pick this out is the fact that we normally think of developmental trajectories as this notion of monotonic growth. The brain, gets bigger and matures in a single direction. But in fact, You can see in certain parts of the brain, circuitry is coming on in certain ways, turning off later in stages of development, monotonic increases in some areas, monotonic decreases in other areas. It's a much more complex dance. And of course, anybody with teenage children will understand the fact that the teenage years, something strange is going on in their brain. They're not like kids, they're not like adults, they're just like some other beast. This data actually shows that in a pretty clear way. And the implications of this for a number of things I'll talk about a little later in the talk. Well, let's try to get some other broad metrics. Of course, with 21,000 articles, I'm afraid I just can't share them all with you today, even though I may have a little extra time because we started early. But nevertheless, if we look at kind of quantitative metrics of the impact of fMRI on the field of cognitive neuroscience, I thought I would turn just kind of for an informal survey to the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience and see what that's looked like over the years. So the journal started, I think, in 1985, just kind of before the dawn of functional imaging. But here's a plot both of the total number of articles that's seen kind of in light blue in the back, and then the different tools that cognitive scientists use as part of their routine work. You can see that not only has there been this exponential increase in just the number of sheer publications in the field of cognitive neuroscience, but that the dominant tool used by these investigators is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And if you combine that with other imaging studies, it's more than 70% of the total articles published in the field of cognitive science use imaging as a central tool for their investigation. I'll just take another cut at the impact. I took an informal survey, unfortunately just of the top 10 departments in the United States. That's what I had access to a list from the U.S. News and World Report. I called up the different places and asked a simple question: do these departments of psychology have their own fMRI systems? Well, Stanford, yes. Sorry, Gary, I think the psychologists have their own scanners now. Quite remarkable. UC Berkeley, yes. Harvard, yes. UCLA, yes. Michigan, yes. Yale, well, as a Harvard man, I can't say I'm surprised. Illinois, yes. I'm going to take a lot of stuff from that, a lot of flack from that comment. Illinois, yes. Princeton, yes. Minnesota, yes. Wisconsin, yes. And I added one more for good measure. MIT, also yes. So I think these departments have more fMRI scanners than they have microscopes. This has just become the fundamental tool of cognitive neuroscience. Well, so has it changed the world? I think if you're a cognitive neuroscientist, it's pretty easy to just say, yes, it has. It has had that impact. And of course, it's not just in the kind of small, closeted world, perhaps, of cognitive neuroscience that fMRI has had its impact. Judy Illes showed not only do the number of articles go up over time, but the number of journals that were publishing functional imaging articles has also gone up at a comparable rate. Here showing that more than 200 different journals, even as far back as 2004, were routinely publishing fMRI articles. And the implication of this is that wholly new fields are being developed based on the tool of functional imaging. And I'll just give one example, I think, though, a very important example, and that's in the domains of social neuroscience. Work from colleagues like the great psychiatrist Chris Frith over in London, looking at the medial frontal cortex and its role in social cognition, have focused on higher order cognitive processes, so-called metacognitive processes, that are the key to many aspects of social cognition. And this work is, of course, building on concepts of theories of mind, how our mind thinks about its own mind, thinks about the minds of other people, and work from folks like Rebecca Sachs and Nancy Kamlish also come to mind. In fact, a whole new journal, the Journal of Social Neuroscience, has just been formed based on these concepts. And of course, the fundamental concept of social neuroscience is to study the neurological, the brain-based underpinnings of social psychology. And sure enough, look at the very first issue of this, and it turns out, although it's probably a little hard for you to read back there, I can't certainly read it up here, but something like, in this case, 5 of the 6 original articles used fMRI as their principal tool. This is how we study the brain in such a wide variety of ways. Of course, the notion of the social brain is another one of those cognitive neuroscience concepts that came to the fore. Randy Buckner mentioned to me that something like 70% of the brain is devoted to social cognition. We know very little bit about it. Tom Insel, the current director of the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, talked about the circuitry of the social brain and noted that key developmental disorders such as autism and schizophrenia were in fact characterized by abnormal social cognition and corresponding deficits in social behavior. And so reading this got me thinking about the potential role that functional imaging has had broadly in the area of mental illness. So let's talk about whether it's really made fundamental changes in that area. Well, I had a chance to talk to Tom Insel, and I posed the very question that I posed to myself, has fMRI changed the world? And the first thing he said was this. He said, despite 4,000 papers, and I think he was complaining about the fact that he was paying for those 4,000 papers, not a single finding has changed routine clinical care in psychiatry. Well, that was kind of a bummer. It was too late for me to, of course, take back the title. But fortunately, I kept my mouth shut, and he kept talking. And he came out and said this, that by 2012, he predicts this will change. So I think we all better get cracking, because 2012 is like next year, right? And that this change will revolve around a new definition of psychiatric disease as disorders of brain circuitry. That's the key concept, that will change our definition of mental illness and our understanding of the causes, treatments, and preventions of mental illness. Pretty profound statement. Of course, this understanding that he talked about just a few weeks ago has been one that's developing over the period of the last, say, dozen years or so. A great article reviewing this was written again by two of the pioneers in this domain, Chris Frith again, and Ray Dolan again from the Wellcome Trust Group. Here they actually describe the fact that it's increasingly evident that lesion models just are inappropriate for our understanding of mental illness, and that a more relevant characterization will be found in terms of disorders of functional interconnections between different brain regions, that these are diseases of whole circuits, not diseases of single spots in the brain. The example that almost everybody I spoke to pointed to in terms of the implications of this circuit-based understanding of mental disorders and how it will ultimately impact in treatment pointed to the work of this amazing pioneer, Helen Mayberg. Many of you may know that Helen has been leading the efforts to do targeted electrode-based modulation, deep brain neurostimulation in cases of intractable depression, medically refractive to treatment depression. In this review, she talked about the last 20 years and how we've changed from our view of psychiatric disorders as psychological and neurochemical to one that specifically involves modulation of brain circuits, just the point, of course, that Tom Insel and Ray Dolan and Chris Frith were making. And that, I'm having a little hard time reading, that this evolving paradigm, has been a growing contribution made by functional imaging to our understanding of these disorders. And indeed, it was functional imaging studies, both her own positron emission studies and subsequent fMRI studies, including pioneering work by Mike Grecius, one of our plenary speakers early in the week, that identified Brodmann Area 25 as a potential target for this modulation, and the successful treatment of depression by the intervention in a specific brain circuit identified from neuroimaging, I think is one of the early triumphs in this domain. But of course, this is not the only way that we can think about the impact of fMRI in the treatment of mental illness, because in fact it has broader implications beyond any specific given treatment. No less an authority than the great neuroscientist Eric Kandel made this prediction just 10 years ago, that as functional imaging became a routine tool and that measuring changes in blood flow came to be seen as equivalent to the kind of physiological measurements we saw with echocardiography, that psychiatry would come to be seen as less different than other medical disorders to both patients and to other doctors. That's a key prediction, and in fact it's a prediction where quantitative data now shows that's come true. This was a very nice study by Judy Illes again, who offered me great help in putting this talk together. This is one of her articles looking at both provider, doctor, and patient attitudes related to functional brain imaging, where she showed that there was an overwhelming positive change in people's association of major depressive illness with the stigma of mental illness based on functional imaging findings. And she subsequently showed in other data that this had equal impact on patients' ability to take their medicine, to try new treatments, et cetera. It was the imaging data that helped change attitudes. I think a really powerful example of how imaging data helped change the whole dynamics came from this story that I ran across related to mental health parity. It's not just individual patients' attitudes that change, but that individual attitudes change in public perception leads to public policy changes. It may seem hard for some to realize, but it's only been very recently that, at least in the United States, coverage, health insurance coverage for mental illness was considered equivalent to coverage for other disorders. Perhaps more civilized parts of the world moved to that sooner. I think some others are still working that way. In the U.S., it was almost a 20-year battle, exactly the 20 years that we're talking about in this lecture. The first federal bill wasn't introduced till 1992, and in fact, it wasn't until the very end of the Bush administration in 2008 that finally in the U.S. Patients with mental illness could get insurance guaranteed by law the same way they could for other medical disorders. So what was happening during those 10 years, and what was the data that led to this change in political will? Well, it was, of course, underlying it, the change in public perception. Fortunately, there were a number of legislators in the U.S., led by Republican Senator Pete Domenici, that helped lead the way. What was the angle they used to leverage the recalcitrant insurance companies? It was the notion and the strategy he took of focusing on biologically based mental illness. And if you look at his congressional testimony, in this case when he proposed the law, yet another time, in this case in 1999, he talked about the fact that the brain is in fact the organ of the mind, just like other organs in the body, and that medical science now has reached the point where we could accurately diagnose mental illness and treat those. And he goes on to say, with this evidence, how could we not cover these individuals? Well, so what was the evidence that he was talking about? If you go back into the congressional record and look at congressional testimony to the key senators and congressmen that were making that decision, it was data like this. Here's actually a snippet from the testimony of Steve Hyman, who was at that time the director of NIMH, where he said that diseases like manic depressive illness represent serious but reversible abnormalities in the function of specific brain circuits. But it wasn't his words that carried the day. I was told that it was the images like these that showed changes in the brain when depression was treated. Pete Domenici's chief of staff and Steve Hyman's chief of staff said the senator was always looking for what he called his broken arm picture. If a kid comes into the hospital, you take an x-ray, it shows a broken arm, everybody knows that needs to be treated. He wanted the equivalent image that he could show his colleagues of the broken brain. And it was these images, these functional data, showing that mental illness could be treated successfully, and it would actually change something. It would change the brain, that carried the day in the political discourse and ultimately led to the finding of parity. So, has functional imaging changed the world of mental illness? Well, its contributions to treatment, I guess I'd have to say, are just emerging. But the fact that we are actually treating mental illnesses at all today on a routine basis, I think owes a large debt of thanks to functional imaging. So I'm going to have to say yes, and I think based on work like Helen Mayberg's, I think there's much more to come. Well, of course, there's always a little bit of a dark side, other side of the coin, if you will, for these developments in functional imaging. This is now an article almost a decade old from The Economist back in, I think, 2003, when they were talking about mind control. And I love this quote. It said at the beginning of the article that genetics, of course, the other big dog in the scientific room, that genetics may yet threaten privacy, kill autonomy, make society homogeneous, and gut the concept of human nature. In other words, destroy civilization. But neuroscience could do all of these things first. Yes! good for us. All right? And of course, what were they picking on? Right? What neuroscience was going to destroy Western civilization, maybe Eastern civilization as well? It was fMRI, things like lie detection, things like being able to look at people's underlying personality traits. And they really got to the key point at the end of the article when they talked about the fact that the really uncomfortable issues that this brings up are things that go right to the heart of human nature, that these are what raises the most vexing questions. In fact, there's been some very nice articles written on neuroethics, kind of a complement to genetics ethics. Another colleague that's been tremendously helpful to me in preparing for this was Adina Roski. She's a professor of philosophy at Dartmouth College, University. She talks about the fact that while there's overlap between genetic ethics and the ethics of neuroscience, are important differences. And she pointed to three particular areas where the ethical issues related to neuroscience, predominantly neuroimaging, were involved. One is related to consciousness, the other issues of decision-making and free will, and the third issues related to moral cognition. I can see my light's yellow. I'm going to have to just skip over the issues of consciousness. I just wanted to at least flash this up. This is a great and fascinating article by Adrian Owen. This is a very active domain, a very interesting one, and I think the bottom line is consciousness is no longer a discussion for philosophers or stoners. It's a argument for neuroscience. How about moral cognition? Let me just quickly present the kind of moral dilemma that philosophers have been thinking about for some time. The so-called trolley dilemma. So a trolley's going down the tracks. It's about to run over 5 workmen here. Would you flip a switch so that it goes onto the other track and just runs over one guy? Well, it turns out most people would say, yeah, they would do that if you ask them this question. And this actually goes back to the philosophy of utilitarianism that was espoused by people like John Stuart Mills, more than 150 years ago. The greatest good for the greatest number. On the other hand, let's take the same calculus, but phrase it a little differently. Here, the trolley's going down. It's about to run over 5 people. The only way to save them is to push a big guy off a bridge that's going to slow down the trolley and stop it before it gets there. Same calculus, 1 for 5. Would you do it? Turns out most people say they wouldn't do it. There's just something morally wrong about pushing somebody off the track to their death. And in fact, this deontologic perspective goes back to the great Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. Well, this conflict has been one that's kind of been at the core of Western philosophy for over 200 years now. And it turns out that the conflict is in our brains because there's distinct neurocircuitry involved for making utilitarian decisions versus these kind of moral judgments of right and wrong in these so-called deontologic perspectives. Josh Green and his colleagues have actually shown that there's different parts of the brain associated with each, such that, for example, it's actually the emotional and social part of the brain that's involved in these kind of deontologic areas, where it's actually higher order areas of the brain, the most recently evolved areas of the brain that actually do this utilitarian judgment. And in fact, comes to the great paradox that the great rationalist Kant is actually decisions along his lines are actually controlled by our emotional part of the brain. Fundamental new understandings of conflict. In the area of free will, again, it's another area where the neuroscience is leading the way in an interesting way here. Just a quick mention of a very interesting article by Sung et al., which showed that with fMRI we can now see changes in the brain up to 10 seconds before anybody is consciously aware of actually making a decision. The decisions are made somewhere well before you think you're aware of it, changing our fundamental notion of determinism. So here we found decisions are coded many seconds before. And the notion of decision-making and how that drives our behavior is, of course, at the key to many aspects of human behavior, none the least of which are kind of our economic decisions. It was Danny Kahneman back in 1979 that put forward this theory of prospect theory, how it is we make certain decisions, and he won the Nobel Prize for this work. And he more recently was quoted in one of his articles as saying that he believes that we're well on the way to the day where these theoretical concepts about decision making are shaped, at least in part, from the neuroscience. And in fact, the neuroscience he talks about in his article is neuroimaging. Well, of course, there have been a number of different theories proposed for the neurocognitive basis for microeconomic decision making. I just thought I would give an example, let the proponent of this idea express it himself. So here we go.
She came in the house, she had the box, Rev saw it. Rev said, "What, another dress? So this is ridiculous. 3 dresses in a week, another dress?" And she tells him, "I didn't want to buy this dress. The devil made me buy this dress."
Well, there you go. Okay, so, why do we buy? Of course, it used to be the devil made you do it. Well, of course, today we know it's the brain made you buy that dress. I don't know if that's going to work. When my wife tries that on me, we'll see. In fact, there's a lot of neuroscience, for example, by Brian Knudsen's article here on the neural predictors of purchases. But this is not just theoretical work. This work is now being turned into a whole industry of people who are using the brain's ability to, our ability to probe the brain's decision making in the domain of neuromarketing. And of course, what's the fundamental tool of neuromarketing? Functional magnetic resonance imaging. That is the tool. It's quite remarkable to me. There are something like 15 different companies that now report that they use functional imaging as keys in their marketing drives. This is now a big business using these tools. And of course, marketing decisions aren't the only decisions that can be made based on brain state. Things like lie detection, other ways to look at covert attitudes are also using functional imaging. Here an article in Popular Science, will the brain lie detection, free the innocent or jail them? In fact, there are 2 companies that are devoted to using fMRI-based lie detection. And in fact, it's now being used in the courtrooms. In fact, a very interesting and thorough article by Owen Jones identified a whole range of areas where we use, where functional imaging and neuroscience are coming into our description of the law, from lie detection to memory studies, the adolescent brain, we'll talk about that in a bit, and even brain-based appeal. And of course, this is my favorite from this. The use of neuroimaging in capital sentencing cases has now become so ubiquitous that you can be sued if you don't do brain imaging to defend your client in a capital sentencing case. It is just a routine part now of how we do business. But I'll argue that besides frivolous lawsuits, that neuroscience has had a much more profound impact on the law, and thus on the basic fabric of our society. I think some very nice examples of this come from 2 very important U.S. Supreme Court rulings. One, back in 2005, was Roper versus Simmons. This held that both the 8th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution forbid the imposition of the death penalty on subjects under the age of 18. I'll have to admit the U.S. was a little slow to come to this. I think even Iran and North Korea no longer allow the death penalty for minors, but even the conservative U.S. Supreme Court finally came around to this. And a more recent decision, Graham versus Florida, this one just last year held that in fact it was unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to life imprisonment without parole for the committing a non-capital offense. So why did they make these decisions? What changed the nature of this very conservative court? Well, if you go and look at the petition sent to the Supreme Court, the petition filed by Terence Graham and his colleagues, you'll actually read this. You'll see that what he presented in his defense was recent studies employing brain imaging technology that show that the adolescent brain, these developmental studies that I was talking about earlier, heighten the propensity for risk-taking and poor decision-making, and that they correlate with immature brain function. And he, of course, then made reference to work like this, James Bjork's work on the development of the posterior mesofrontal cortex and its recruitment and risky behaviors in teens, and Nir Eshel's work on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex and how they are also immature in the developing teenage brain. And in fact, this data had a direct impact on Justice Kennedy's majority opinion. You can read this. He said, although the precise neurobiological mechanisms are continuing in research, it can now not be contested that important aspects of brain maturation, particularly those involving the brain's executive functions, remain incomplete even in late adolescence, and that the developments in psychology and brain science continue to show fundamental differences between juveniles and adult brains. For example, parts of the brain involved in behavior control continue to mature through late adolescence. This was neuroimaging data. And in fact, summing this up, his concluding point was that the biological basis for differences in juvenile conduct provide further support for the conclusion of less culpability should be attached to juvenile conduct than to similar conduct by adults. And that was the key concept. That lack of culpability meant that it was just not appropriate to give them the ultimate penalties. I think this is an example, but not the only example we're going to see in the future of the power of functional imaging to change fundamental aspects of our kind of social contract. Oops. Can we froze. Well, it's a good thing because I'm both out of time and almost out of slides. Any chance we can advance to the next slide? There we go. I just wanted to say that functional imaging is going to have other kinds of broad contexts. Just for example, this study talking about socioeconomic status and how it influences brain development are likely to have important policy implications, education policy, social policy, issues related to poverty. Functional brain data is going to be, and our understanding of the brain is going to be worked into a wide variety of kind of preeminent social questions that we deal with on a regular basis. So, has it changed society? Well, I'd have to say it's beginning to. And even though there's a lot of kind of scary things, neuromarketing, lie detection, covert reading of our brains, a lot of scary thoughts out there, the reality is most of the most important implications so far have been broadly for the good. In medicine, in patients' attitudes, access to health care, and in giving us a more enlightened view of fundamental aspects of human nature. So with that, I certainly want to thank the many people that helped me greatly in putting this talk together, and leave you with this final image of Paul Lauterbur and a comment he made to me. Very good suggestion when I was in yet another setting going long on a talk. He said, no, the key is you want to finish early and always leave them wanting more. So hopefully you'll take this advice in your next talk better than I did on this one. Thanks very much.